All right, welcome to the Bridge Podcast. This is episode 56. I'm your host, John Lamberton. Today I'm joined by David Borgo. David is a saxophonist, improviser. He teaches at University of California, San Diego. I always want to throw Southern in there, but it's just University of California. Got projects like KaiBorg and Chronomorphic, and the author of Sink or Swim. That's sync with a Y and a C for listeners who aren't seeing the word. Improvising music in a complex age. David,
Sink,
welcome to the
sink or
podcast.
sink, yeah, thank you so much,
Or
John.
Sink or Swarm, sorry.
Sink or swarm. Yeah, I was going to give a slight correction there.
I was so
Um,
stuck on the sync being, auditorily the same as other sync. But anyway, welcome to the podcast.
yeah, thank you.
Um,
Glad to be here.
so, as you know, I start these conversations out asking people about their coffee habits. Could you tell me about your coffee habits, preferences, anything that you can share about that?
Oh, sure. Well, I'm certainly not a coffee snob, but I do enjoy a nice dark roast, and I try to limit myself to 2 cups a day. I guess my go-to device was the AeroPress.
Mhm.
Um, Until recently, though, I was fortunate to spend 5 weeks in Paris this summer teaching a course on jazz in Paris. And the apartment we were renting there had a nice French press. And I sort of got enamored with French press coffee instead. So just recently, I bought myself a French press and have switched directions a bit.
Nice. So you like the sort of higher body, thicker coffees?
Yeah, I think I like when you can see a little residue on the top of the cup, a little
I feel like
oily residue.
it's an underappreciated quality in coffee these days. Everybody wants, the most thick paper filter possible, but yeah, I can appreciate some sediment.
Good.
So before we get into the book, I just wanted to ask a little bit about your projects, Chronomorphic and KaiBorg. Um, it seems like in KaiBorg, you're basically doing, kind of computer augmentations of your instruments. And I'm curious how you think about that, sort of what the guiding principles are. I assume that you're sort of, you and your collaborator are doing sort of, your own bespoke software on that.
hmm Yeah, so, well, first off, my collaborator in KaiBorg is Jeff Kaiser, a really wonderful trumpeter and computer musician, and he also now has a faculty position at the University of Central Missouri in their computer music department. Um, and yeah, I really have to credit Jeff with bringing me into that world. He's expert at Max MSP, so he was very sort of patient in teaching me the ropes so that I could design my own systems. And I guess maybe like many, I've probably gone through way too many different iterations of my system. Uh, I mean, at one point I had kind of switched from a computer to an iPad because there was really a wealth of things that you could do on an iPad-based system. Um, and even more recently, I've kind of gone back to hardware-based, signal processing, just because in some ways I like the simplicity of all of that. I guess I come to it, yeah, primarily as an artist rather than a programmer or a technologist, which means I'm kind of fascinated by. I think once my ears opened up to the sort of electroacoustic spectrum, as an improviser, you realize it is a kind of augmentation, right, of your natural. I've developed over the decades a kind of intimate connection with the saxophones and flutes and things like that. All of a sudden now you have another agency seemingly, right, that's swimming around in there, that's altering your sound, and you're getting this immediate sort of transmorphing of what you've just played, and that enough is kind of inspires new forms of creativity. And then, of course, I always enjoy playing with other people, not just with the computer. So, now you're sort of negotiating this interaction between the other humans on stage, but also all the devices on stage. And I guess in terms of my theoretical writing, I've often gone to things like actor network theory or other theories that actually talk about how we can kind of spread agency beyond just the human participants, right? That the all of the sort of influences and energies that are coming together to impact cognition are multiple, right? And they're coming from the room and from the sort of social environment and so much more.
Interesting. I think of people like George Lewis, who you mentioned in the book, and like Michael Desson, who does the Digibone, and all these people that are doing sort of these like hyper instruments where they're augmenting their instrument. I'm curious if there are any other influences, that impacted how you conceived of this type of approach.
Yeah, that's a great question. Although I often think of George's system, his classic Voyager, as the primary question he was asking audiences to entertain was, can we empathize with this computer musician on stage, right? Can we feel as if it's deserving of our empathy in the same way that human performers are? But yeah, I mean, I readily admit as an instrumentalist that probably the paradigm that most closely matches what I like to do is this hyper instrument, right, or augmented instrument, where you're kind of taking what you already do and adding new layers to it.
Very cool. Cool. So to get into the book, Sink or Swarm, I was reading the revised version, which came out February of this year, and the last version was 2004, correct? Uh,
Yeah, I think 5 or 6 is, it came out in hardback in 5 and maybe paperback in 6.
so I guess like I didn't read the original version, so I'm curious what sort of the big changes were.
Sure. Yeah, in a way, I took advantage of the opportunity to do a revised version to really almost rewrite it from the ground up. So in some ways, I think of it as a new book. I mean, there certainly are things that were in the first edition that held over, but I've, in some ways, I wanted to benefit from 15 plus years of new
Hmm.
thinking about it and writing various shorter essays and articles. I would say that one of the shifts is that I did discuss more directly sort of human-machine interaction. So sorry about that, and electronics and electroacoustic improvising. I think one thing I tried to do was sort of arrive at a more balanced view, I guess, if you like, of the relationship between what we often call improvisation and composition. I think there was a sort of polemic in the earlier version, understandably so. I mean, I still will readily admit that, one thing I do is advocate for the importance of improvisation, that we should value it, that it should be a viable career path, and I think in many respects it has been devalued or undervalued. But I think I've arrived at a place in my life and my thinking where I'm essentially the final section of the revised version is about complementarity and metastability, this idea that, improvisation and composition essentially imply one another. It really would be impossible to, or I think it would be ill-advised to separate them out categorically.
Yeah, it seems like there's a saying that people often refer to, which is like, improvisation is just spontaneous composition. And I feel like you can take that as a truth, but it's also like there's more to it than that, I think, which I think you're trying to get into. So how do you define improvisation specifically? Is it about spontaneity, or is it about indeterminacy, or a little bit of both? Do you think about it as a big picture?
Yeah. Maybe first, I'll approach the question from a more personal vantage point, because I think we kind of get in trouble when we do, want to make these stark categorical distinctions. What did first attract me to improvisation? When I was a teenager learning how to play the saxophone and starting to learn how to play jazz, there was this kind of epiphany when I realized, in checking out Charlie Parker's recordings, that he could play the same composition, right, the same tune, and night after night produce, radically different solo, a different improvisation. And, as a young person, that was a huge epiphany, right? That you could actually make music on the spot that wasn't kind of just beholden to reading the notes on the page. I think that at least inspiration has always stuck with me. This idea of making music in the moment, negotiating the musical moment with other people and in front of an audience. This is what jazz musicians and improvisers live for. But yeah, I think we do get into trouble when we want to kind of come up with these little catchphrases like spontaneous composition, because if for no other reason than, our surrounding culture tends to devalue spontaneity, right? We like people to follow rules and, really think long and hard about what they're going to do before they do it. And, and yeah, where the letter of the law is always just that, right? It's the letter of the law. It's the written word that carries the most. So I tend to think that it's better to think of improvisation and composition as complementarity, right, in a complementary relationship. Meaning, I mean, it would be impossible to improvise is to compose, right? You know, I guess the most basic definition of composition is to put things together, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't really imagine anyone composing without improvising, without bringing creativity and thinking through new ideas. I mean, even on that most fundamental level, they obviously imply one another. But I think, you know, the idea of metastability is that, you know, so yeah, once you acknowledge there's this complementary relationship, then you can kind of begin to parse out, you know, what aspects of creativity are we, you know, maybe emphasizing the most or valuing the most. I mean, there's often when people talk about improvisation, they go to the conversation metaphor, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
having a conversation. And that, you know, has maybe some shortcomings, but I think it's useful to think about, you know, when you're improvising, you know, on the one hand, I don't know what I'm going to say right now, but on the other hand, you know, you have a long-lived history. You've kind of composed a way of being in the world. You've composed a life. And so, yeah, I like to think of musical improvisers as essentially composing a life in music, right? They've created a relationship to sound and their instruments and the kinds of collaborators that they work with. Just as composers, you know, are obviously nurturing an improvisatory ethos, right? If they want to continue to create and come up with new ideas. So I guess I'm trying to arrive at a point in my thinking in life where I don't position these as opposites.
Mm-hmm.
There's a nice book by Paul Rinsler called The Contradictions of Jazz, where he outlines, you know, how we often position things as somehow polar opposites, right? Like how could you be both assertive and open at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
We somehow think that that's not possible, but in fact, that's what improvisers are doing, right? They're asserting themselves. They're sort of telling their, you know, their truth, musically speaking. But they're also, you know, incredibly open to, you know, the input of others and trying to negotiate that moment. And I always think about musical improvisation more as on the social level, per se, than the, you know, the technical or musical level.
Interesting. So, you know, I've spoken with your colleague Shlomo Dubnov, who does a lot of work on like machine improvisation or like computer-based improvisation. And you know, I feel like for a lot of people, hearing the idea of a computer, this thing that isn't sentient, supposedly, you know, improvising sounds like a little bit of a, you know, a wacky idea. But I'm curious. I mean, do you think that improvisation, in the sense that you're talking about, is uniquely human, or how does it extend into sort of the machine realm?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I love Shlomo's work, and yeah, he's, you know, among, you know, many researchers that are kind of trying to, I mean, I guess that's the sort of the key word of the moment, right, is artificial intelligence and all of these sorts of things. I tend to think we're probably better served thinking about kind of augmenting, right? So, you know, our human cognition, at least in my view, is already fully embodied and situated and distributed. We could talk more about that if you like, but the, you know, the kind of 4E model of cognition is that cognition's embedded, embodied, inactive, and extended, right? And so in that sense, you know, the way we think is always informed by and shaped by the kinds of tools and resources and environments we inhabit. And, you know, computers are just the latest addition to that repertoire. So, yeah, I think maybe the better way to think about it is, rather than positioning them as sort of isolated agents, you know, and in some ways humans themselves are not isolated agents. You know, we place a lot of value on individuality and, you know, individual agency. And there are good reasons to do that, but I think we also need to acknowledge that, you know, it takes a village, right? You know, we are all sort of shaped. As an ethnomusicologist, I believe deeply in the idea that, you know, culture, we are enculturated beings, right? We grow up with a worldview that is shaped by the kinds of cultural and social norms and values and experiences we've had. So yeah, I guess to go back to the machine, I would, you know, rather than trying to think of them as isolated, intelligent beings, I prefer to think of it as, a new dimension that's being added to our already extended cognitive realms.
It's sort of a weird question, but just to try to, hone in on a specific aspect of this improvisation definition, uh, if somebody is using, for instance, like a random process like rolling dice or something, um, to determine some aspect of their, musical performance that they're about to do, would you consider that improvisation in any sense, or is that just sort of indeterminacy?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I mean, I guess to the extent that I deal with it in the book, even in the first edition, I talked a bit about the kind of, I think it's a bit of a tortured history in sort of 20th century music, that all of these other terms arose in some ways to avoid saying improvisation, right? Indeterminacy, stochastic music, intuitive music. There were these composers often preferred terms that didn't involve using improvisation. I mean, we could talk about maybe some racial dimensions to that equation, in part because I think improvisation was becoming so heavily identified with black music and jazz in particular.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, maybe entropy is maybe a better word than randomness in that sense. And I mean, entropy is sort of always a component of life and in musical life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you work with electronics, like say an electroacoustic improvising setting, I mean, randomness is often an important tool, right? Maybe I want to set it up so when I press this particular button, I don't quite know what to expect, right? What's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think embracing randomness to a certain extent is useful, but again, I guess I think listeners and myself in particular, often what we want to hear is the sort of negotiation of agency happening in the musical moment.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm curious. So like I think about complexity and chaos and sort of complicatedness as all distinct things. Um, and complicatedness, I think, is kind of interesting to me because I think of it as like kind of like it doesn't have that special emergence or sort of like self-organizing quality of
Mm-hmm.
complexity. And I'm curious where your mind goes with the notion of complicatedness as distinct from those other aspects. Because like I would think maybe like certain types of design, like if you think about like the reductionism that has to go into making a plane, it's like more engineering than art maybe. And there's something about it that's extremely powerful, but it's like it doesn't have the same sort of like parsimony of like a complex, function. Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely onto something. Right, these terms, complicated, complex, chaotic. They 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 sort of have a network relationship to one another. But I think how I talked about it in the revised book is that complicated is essentially a relation of things, right? You can make a very complicated relationship between things, but complex is a relationship between relationships, meaning, let's see, what would be, like you could have a very complicated family tree, right? That your relatives are kind of sort of connected to one another in complicated ways. But I think you have complex family dynamics in the sense that, if you were really to try to understand, how all of the members of your family, all of their influences and interests and activities intersected or overlapped or didn't, that's a sort of complex problem, one that you really couldn't arrive at a single answer to, right? It's a sort of evolving, as you mentioned, self-organizing, people's interests are shifting, right? And trying to map that out would be a very complex process, but you could map out a kind of complicated family tree if you were only interested in, well, how is this person related to that person,
Mm-hmm.
biologically speaking. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Let's see here.
I guess if I wanted to do a musical example, yeah, I mean, sometimes I resist this, but I think when you can obviously write very complicated musical notation, and many composers do. Some even, of course, write music that's meant to be more complicated than a human performer can
Hmm.
feasibly parse. Um, but so we could talk about the relationship between the dots on the page as a complicated one, but the actual music being performed is always going to be complex. Meaning there's going to be just too many variables to keep track of in terms of, even if it's just a performer trying to interpret a Fairney Howe score or something. Um, the all of those other dimensions of the essentially the instrument setup for that day, or how the performer's feeling, or the acoustic of the room, or just the sort of energy being generated by other people listening. These would all be things that you'd want to take account of if you really wanted to have a fuller understanding of that performance.
Hmm. You mentioned sort of the racial angle on improvisation and that term being used less. I'm curious to hear more about that because I mean, like, I guess like stochastic, like I've seen people get irritated by, like people like me saying stochastic and sort of like inappropriately using it. Um, and so I don't know, like I'm probably guilty of saying technical terms instead of something that's just like normal and embodied like improvisation. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear more about that.
I mean, I think technically stochastic means essentially random, like throwing dice. And I would probably be inclined to argue that humans don't do anything that's random, right? We
Hmm.
we actually, because of our enculturation, because of our sort of patterns and rituals, we have a very sort of developed way of being in the world. I mean, one thing creative improvisers can do is maybe try to become more aware of that and acknowledge that, and maybe push past their normal routines and expectations. But even then, it's kind of a conscious choice to do that, right? It's to become more aware of, well, what are my habits? What are my licks, so to speak? And
Hmm.
how can I get myself out of that rut? But that's certainly not random, right? It's a sort of conscious, creative decision to do something new. So yeah, in that sense, maybe randomness doesn't play much of a role in the kind of improvised music that at least I enjoy.
Hmm. But the racial dimension of
Oh
the
yeah, the racial dimension. Well, I would say, maybe this does go back to George Lewis. Even he has a very frequently cited article that he talked about Afrological and Eurological understandings of music in the 20th century, and he uses maybe Charlie Parker and John Cage as sort of stand-ins for that larger discourse. But I mean, George's argument really, it's not a racial one, but it's more about culture. But in Afrological musics, the idea is not to somehow have the music be devoid of human intention and human agency and those sorts of things, but in fact to fully embrace that, to negotiate that. Miles Davis wanted to call jazz social music, right? He didn't like the word jazz, but social music sounded right to him. Whereas I think in the more Eurological tradition, as George was laying it out, there has been this tendency to try to separate, quote unquote, music from the agency and intentions and humanity of the people involved in making it. So yeah, I think some of those terms that were meant to avoid saying improvisation were just that. We're trying to, sort of keep that messy social stuff at bay, and focus on this sort of music as an ontological work of art, right? Something that we can separate out from all of the messiness.
So, in terms of complexity, like I feel like, complexity is like this magical thing to me because it's like all these interacting parts generate some sort of new whole. And I guess like there's something about life and complexity, like in the sense of like biological life, where it's like it has that animated quality. And I think about like cellular automata and how like you can have these like little rule-based binary code things that almost appear to be lifelike because just like the rules maintain their movement.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious. I mean, like, are you interested in like Stephen Wolfram's work or like that type of stuff? where does your mind go with like the notion of like complexity as an aesthetic or like as some sort of like life force that we connect with artistically?
Sure. Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, I certainly know Wolfram's work. I don't think I've read word for word his massive books,
Neither have
but I've played with things on his website often, and I think more broadly, I mean, what you're hinting at is this idea of self-organization, right? That it's a foundational principle of life, even consciousness, right? That somehow we get something greater than or different from the sum of its parts, right? And yeah, I've been fascinated by theories of, well, autopoiesis is one, but yeah, there's consciousness studies has really kind of taken off in the sense that for a long time it was a taboo topic to even write about consciousness, but now I think there's a lot of really wonderful thinkers writing some great theories about consciousness. And how it is it's an emergent property. I guess I like the word emergence a lot too. But it can be tricky to get your head around, right? Because, like you said, it seems magical, right? How can something, emerge from a purely physical or material realm? At times, I've described myself as an anti-reductionist materialist, meaning, I do believe, that in the material world and, sort of the natural processes that we are able to model, at least through science, whether it's biological sciences or, yeah, the cellular automata are essentially a kind of modeling technique for trying to understand biological processes. But I'm anti-reductionist in the sense that I think for far too long we thought that you could just break systems apart into their component parts and get smaller and smaller components until you get to the subatomic level. And if you could only understand everything that was going on at the subatomic level, everything else would be, fully comprehensible.
Mm-hmm.
But I tend to, of course, subscribe to the view that at new levels of complexity, new levels of organization, new emergent behaviors appear. And yeah, life was clearly a fairly significant moment of emergence when somehow you get these little single cellular organisms that are able to essentially they're making some decisions to seek out things that are beneficial to their sustenance and things that are detrimental they're
Mm-hmm.
trying to avoid. And yeah, it's those kinds of basic principles that then compound and complexify, if you like, and you start to get, essentially the emergence of cognition and consciousness and what we think of as human consciousness. I think there's also been a nice push against the idea that humans are somehow, of a different kind and order than everything else that we know. The more we understand human cognition and consciousness and emotion, the more we can realize that it extends throughout much of the life world.
I'm curious if you have any sort of like, I mean, I'd be curious what theories of mind or like sort of like writing on consciousness you're most convinced by or most intrigued by. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it can change day to day depending on which book I've read most recently. But let's see. I read a book by I think his name's Mark Solms. It's called The Hidden Valley,
Hmm.
and I think one of the things he was trying to do is there's also been this obviously brain centric move in the last few decades to try to locate where things are occurring in the brain. And often we talk about the neocortex, as the site of our humanity. But what he was arguing is that it's much lower in the brainstem, essentially, that consciousness is emerging. Let's see. I think Michael Graziano has some interesting things that I've read. Anil Seth is another author. Yeah, it's. In a way, there's a really kind of vibrant discourse right now around consciousness and how we can best talk about it. And yeah, I hope that helps a bit.
It's interesting that you mentioned like sort of the nervous system because like there's that passage in the book about basically like you don't improvise at the speed of how you think or at the rate that you think, but more at the rate of your nervous system. And so like that gets to the sort of embodiedness of improvisation. I mean, like I'm trying to imagine what like a brain in a vat improvising would be like, but can you talk a little bit more about the sort of embodied cognition element of improvisation?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think that might have been Pauline Oliveros that I was quoting at that point. But yeah, I tend to think, yeah, there's this one. I mean, I guess again, I'll maybe just talk from a personal vantage point. When I'm improvising, the sort of phenomenological sense that I often have is that I'm not fully aware of why I'm doing things or what I'm doing, even in some instances. And I think that's because what we are doing is kind of shutting down some of our, and even some of the neurological studies support this idea that we're shutting down our kind of, what's the best way to say it? Our, our self-monitoring systems, right, in the frontal and neocortex, so that we can operate in a way that we're not always thinking about and critiquing and reflecting on our activity. So in that sense, I do think there's a kind of desire among improvisers to try to cultivate that state where you're really, thinking with the body rather than the brain, I guess, if you wanted to hold to those things. But I guess the embodied cognition approach is actually to try to get past that binary between body and brain, right? Our brain is already fully embodied in the sense that it's an organ, it's a kind of predictive organ of the body that
Mm-hmm.
is doing its best, shut in this dark, cold place, trying to figure out, based on the kinds of information that the body is sending it, what to anticipate, what to expect, right? How to maybe ramp up and be best prepared for the next moment. I mean, I'm kind of obviously speaking rather loosely, but this is the predictive mind hypothesis, right? That, essentially this is what our brain is primarily doing, is trying to predict our engagement with the world. And it does that through a lived history of being in the world, right? Of having a body and having sets of experiences and cultivating expectations. So that, yeah, to me, that's what improvisers are doing, is just that. You're in a kind of predictive mode when you're improvising. You're trying to anticipate, well, what might happen next? What might someone do? But you're not, rationalizing that or reflecting on it, but rather sort of embracing this predictive mode that we use just to get around, right? Just to walk on the sidewalk, a crowded sidewalk or something.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some other examples people give, is that, you're not necessarily thinking about how to avoid the people walking on this crowded sidewalk. You're just sort of making the right kinds of predictions and moves so that you don't bump into anyone.
In terms of like the predictive thing, I heard somebody describe art once as basically like one way to look at it is manipulating the energy parameter in this sort of like Carl Friston style free energy way. And it makes me think of like stand-up comedians where when they violate your expectation, that's generally like the sort of like peak of the aesthetic experience. And so I
Mm-hmm.
mean, is that sort of like another element of improviser's secret sauce is violating expectations? Is there an aesthetic specifically to that?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, yeah, comedy is a nice analog to explore. And yeah, it's not only that they violate the expectation, but I think it's really about the timing, right? I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think good comedians will tell you, you could say the same exact thing, but if your timing is off, you don't get the laugh. And yeah, I think in that sense, timing is crucial to improvisers. Yeah, well, last night I played a 4-hour jazz gig, which I hadn't done in a while, just playing, standards with some new musicians that I hadn't played with before. And so there's always this kind of process of negotiating. I got some new musicians to play with, how can I anticipate what they might do? But, well, why do I bring that up? Well, I think it's possible, both from the player's perspective, but also from the listener's perspective, to have a strong sense of when somebody's, really surfing that wave of the improvised moment, right, is really there, and their timing and everything seems to be functioning, at its peak.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that, even for the player, there is this kind of back and forth between, oh, wait, why am I doing that? I've done that a million times before, and then trying to just shut up that part of the mind and, in a sense, kind of surf the wave of the shared musical moment. And when you're doing that, you're often doing far more interesting things musically, and I think other people can sense it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other musicians and the audience can also sense that you're really, firing on all cylinders, right? And so I think a good comedian, it's the same way. You just sort of sense that their timing they're fully engaged and their timing is great. Well, I guess you mentioned Carl. Well, go ahead. I was going to say something about Carl Friston, but I'm not an expert by any means. I mean, I do find that work fascinating, and I might need another lifetime to fully understand it. But actually, I think it's in that Mark Solms book where there's a nice chapter dedicated to Friston's work, where he finally, at least, had me for a brief moment make me feel like I understood it. But yeah, I do think, Friston is just on the vanguard of trying to, in some ways, mathematically model self-organizing processes and these things that we can resonate with and feel and understand. But it's also important to have people that are, trying to model it well. I tend to think of all science as just a form of modeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a safer way to engage with scientific results, right?
Definitely. So when you're talking about firing on all cylinders, it makes me think of flow as put forth by Csikszentmihalyi, and that seems to be like an essential part of any improviser's world, is like getting into a flow state. And I'm curious what insights you have in terms of like reliably getting into that state, and how it impacts your capabilities as an improviser.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and a hard one to answer. I mean, I guess the quick answer is like anything else. The more you do it, the more reliably you can get there. And you can sometimes even sense, like, if you haven't been improvising with other people in a while, there can be a sort of moment where you're sort of transitioning, like, how can I get back to this flow state that I'd like to be in? I mean, on the other hand, it's sort of completely unpredictable. You can both prepare and try to be ready for it, but well, I think I have in the book there, the idea that when you really only recognize the flow state afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
because you miss being in it, right? When you're actually in it, in some ways you're not able to, or you wouldn't want to, sort of be aware that you were in the flow state. Yeah, I mean, I think Csikszentmihalyi's idea of, at least the way I've always thought about it, is that the demands of the situation and the sort of the preparation and skills and expertise that one brings to the situation are perfectly matched, right? So that in some ways you're more likely to reach a flow state when you're improvising with improvisers that are able to challenge you but not over challenge you, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're sort of, it's, in that ways it's maybe like sports. You'll reach a flow state when you're playing with competitors that are at your level, or maybe ideally slightly above your level, right? So that you can always be learning something new. But if you're playing with Steph Curry or something, you've got no chance of entering the flow state because you're just not going to have any chance at all of keeping up. So yeah, I think it's about cultivating situations where the demands, the challenges are well matched to what you bring to the situation.
Gotcha. There's a whole chapter where you sort of spend a lot of time on Evan Parker's improvisations, and Evan Parker is like such an interesting improviser, and I'm curious if you got any insights into like his particular flow state, or anything that you can mention from that.
Sure. No, I mean, Evan Parker was probably the single reason that I started along this path. I mean, I came up through, sort of the jazz world, and, gradually, of course, learned to love people like Ornette Coleman and Late Coltrane and Cecil Taylor. But yeah, Evan Parker, the first time I heard him, which was actually at David Liebman's house at like a saxophone workshop I was participating in. Liebman put on some solo soprano of Evan Parker, and it just blew my mind. I mean, I wasn't sure how to parse it. Is that still a saxophone? You just kind of, all of a sudden, a whole new world opens up. So, yeah, I mean, I would say, and getting to know Evan a bit through the process of writing these things has been wonderful. And I think I've always resonated with his thinking about improvisation because, I mean, on several levels, but I mean, one level I always appreciate is that he's actually not afraid to situate himself within this kind of jazz community and continuum, whereas many improvisers, have gone to great lengths to distance themselves from the J word, from jazz. Mm-hmm. Whereas Evan will clearly say that, it was people like Pharoah Sanders and John Chikai and Archie Shepp and, many others that inspired him to follow his path. But I also like about Evan that he tends to think about the improvising process in this kind of 4E way, right? That it's embodied, it's embedded, it's inactive and extended. That he really has a sensitivity to that all of these variables matter, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, from the, just the purely mechanical, like how's the horn functioning? How's my reed working today? How are my, chops? But more importantly to this idea of like the sound of every space will have its sort of sonic characteristics to explore. So as you probably know, in his solo practice, it's almost as if he's duetting with the space, right? The acoustics of the space. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I think he's, this idea of there's this wonderful complex feedback loop. I mean, Evan always, he seemed to like the idea of cybernetics, which is a field that I've loved exploring the history of, even though people don't use that word too often. I really think it was a hugely influential mm-hmm. idea in 20th century science, right? How do we try to understand complex feedback? So yeah, I think that's always appealed to me in Evan's approach, is that whether it's just him in a room, in front of a few people, he's intimately aware of the complexity of that situation, or whether it's him playing with his regular collaborators, or, he also is someone that is happy to embrace playing with people for the first time up on stage, right? So, mm-hmm. I always like how he kind of balances those aspects of improvisation. I mean, I think maybe some folks, understandably, maybe they just want to play with people that they, have cultivated a strong, relationship with, and there's others, of course, that want to play with people brand new every night.
Considering like Evan Parker or Dave Liebman or John Coltrane, like as these exemplars of like sort of doing complexity and chaos and what they're doing, compared to somebody like Charlie Parker, is kind of interesting to me because like I guess when I was like, growing up and learning improvisation, like I always felt this aversion to transcription, and like I was always put under so much pressure to transcribe. It was like, to learn how to improvise, you need to transcribe people. And so it makes me think of like a GPT-3 engine where it's like, it's read all of the internet. Now it can like spit out sort of passable narrative. And like, I feel like that's essentially what it would be like if I were like learning every Charlie Parker solo so I can do a sort of, less good version of Charlie Parker. But then like the Evan Parkers of the world are like doing this entirely new thing. I guess like, how do you think about sort of like that, training up on like, I guess referent versus like trying to always forge some sort of new path?
Okay. Yeah. Another great question. Let's see. So you're talking about those sort of the new AI that can produce passable language. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sort of write a student's essay for them.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I would say. I mean, again, on a personal level, sometimes I've described myself as kind of a musical Jekyll and Hyde, in the sense that I still very much can enjoy playing, standards even, although I tend to prefer, originals and kind of, but in the jazz tradition, right? And then I also very much enjoy KaiBorg and chronomorphic maybe, and these projects and opportunities that can take you rather far away from this more mainstream jazz tradition. But here again, I guess I'm trying to arrive at a point in my life where I don't see these things as completely opposite and disparate activities. I think, when I did a fair bit of transcribing when I was younger, although, I don't do much of it anymore. But I think there's some utility in that process because it's, if anything, it's just kind of speeding up your hearing and giving you more nuance to your hearing so that, things that otherwise you would just miss, you're able to, focus on and hone in on. But I think part of the learning process when you transcribe is also realizing that you could never possibly replicate Charlie Parker or Coltrane. It's as if in trying to emulate them, you're slowly developing and discovering what's you in that equation, what's makes it that you would never sound like Charlie Parker or John Coltrane. And in that sense, maybe it's not so different than what Evan Parker was doing. He was, doing that with maybe Pharoah Sanders and R.G. Shipp, as I said. But, he was sort of charting a trajectory that could emphasize things that felt more personal to him. Maybe I'll try. I was going to try one other sort of analog. If we go back to conversation, clearly we all still enjoy just having conversations about topics, right? A topic is essentially a referent, right, or a standard. We're going to talk about, well, let's talk about politics, or let's talk about sports, or, these kind of normal avenues for conversation. But even as you're doing that, what's fun about having those conversations is that you may still land on a really kind of interesting or novel way to think about something, or just phrase something, or you make a joke about something and your timing is great and everybody around you laughs. There's a certain kind of improvised joy in just having a conversation around a well-trodden subject. But there's also a joy in in some ways, maybe non-referential improvising is trying to push at, trying to get farther away from the idea of syntax, right? That you're, when we're forming sentences, we're following syntax pretty precisely, such that if I make a grammatical mistake, it'll pop out to you, even before you are consciously aware of it. You'll notice I made a mistake. So a lot of music can have that sensibility, right? That it has a kind of syntax, and we can be surprised, and improvisers can consciously try to surprise you. So maybe that's a little bit different in music. You can violate syntax, so to speak, and that's some of the joy of it. But there is a way to improvise where you're pushing even farther away from the idea of music having a syntax. And that's more of maybe a stream of consciousness writing or poetry where, it's as if the sounds of the syllables are more important than anything semantic in the content of what you're saying.
That makes sense. Let's see here. I guess as we were getting towards the end here, you mentioned time and qualia in the book, and it's funny. I feel like I'm part of what's called Qualia Twitter right now. There's a research institute called Qualia Research Institute that's really interested in this stuff. But meanwhile, I sort of find myself identifying with Daniel Dennett's perspective, which is kind of this, spicy take of oh, consciousness doesn't exist, qualia isn't real. And so I'm curious if you have any takes on that sort of notion, because I don't think that it's an illusion, but I think that we don't have to talk about Alain Vital. We can sort of move forward from terminology like that. But I don't know. I'm just curious if you have any takes on that sort of perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, it's maybe. I feel like Dennett maybe wants to be a little bit reductionist when he's doing that, right? He wants to, sort of give you an answer that denies the emergent quality of qualia. I'm more inclined, if I'm going to embrace this complexity paradigm and emergence paradigm, to think about that, there's a richness in the lived moment that we experience as qualia that betrays any kind of simplistic reductionist viewpoint. There was I'll give you one quick example. There was a wonderful woman and friend and a piano player that she sadly passed, but Ryoko Gogen. She was actually married to Joseph Gogen, who was a UCSD professor who also passed, but he and I worked a bit on this idea of qualia in musical consciousness. But Ryoko, as a pianist, she could sit down at the piano and, maybe play an A440 on the keyboard, and then, play a series of, harmonic progressions or just movements that made you feel that A completely differently. And then she would do something and then play the A, and all of a sudden that A is felt completely differently just based on the musical context that she's creating. And that always stuck with me, because that was a reminder that, the qualia of that A is always going to be dependent on how it's essentially been set up, right? This is what musicians are doing all the time, is creating a context in which you can hear something familiar as new.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know how that relates to the kind of redness of red that philosophers love to ponder. But I think in some ways, the A-ness of A440 is just that. It's context dependent. We really will experience it, because we don't hear frequency, right? We hear this. Pitch is already a kind of qualitative way of experiencing an acoustic phenomenon. We don't actually hear the way. We don't hear cycles per second, let's say, right? We hear a pitch. That's already a qualitative way of experiencing music. But even beyond that, obviously the pitch is embedded in this much larger temporal moment.
Yeah, you hear the relationships. You don't hear the absolute hertz.
Yeah, that's it. The idea of protension and retension, in phenomenological thought, is that the sort of thick moment that we're living in, this kind of feeling of presence, is always going to be inflected by protensions and retentions.
Gotcha. Interesting. I guess you mentioned cybernetics, and in the book you also mentioned Kevin Kelly, the futurist, and I'm kind of curious. I find myself very interested in this sort of realm of stuff, and when somebody's a musician that's interested in this, I'm particularly intrigued, because I feel like the other people are into this futurism territory, or usually rich technologists who have outlandish opinions. But when somebody's an artist and they're into sort of futurist stuff, I'm intrigued. So I'm curious, sort of how you see yourself in that culture, and what aspects of that culture you find interesting.
Okay. Yeah, maybe like you, I don't know how often I want to put on the futurist clothes, but from time to time I enjoy it. One thing I encountered recently, maybe I'll quickly share, is that, and it's something I did sort of write about in an article that didn't make it into the book per se, but this idea of, we talk about augmented reality and virtual reality, and we tend to favor the visual modality, right? There's always this idea you're putting on glasses and you're going to be in the metaverse. But really it's our auditory sense that situates us so profoundly in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes tell students, if you shut off the lights and you have to make it from the bathroom to the bed at night or something, you're really actually using your ears to a great extent to negotiate, how you're going to get there. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think there's a whole realm of sort of augmented reality through our ears, or more broadly through our senses of audition, that needs to be explored. And the thing I wrote about a while back was, it was an iPad app called Reality Jockeys. I think they've since gone under. But it was essentially a Max MSP patch that you could have on your iPhone that, had some presets that, as you were going about your day-to-day activities in the world, riding the bus, what have you, you could, click that preset and it would transform, using the microphone on the phone, what was going on around you, and you could kind of interact with it playfully. And, it seemed to me that general way of augmenting our reality acoustically and sonically, auditorily, um, was fascinating. But I guess maybe the company ran up against not everybody wants to be having an altered experience while they're on the bus.
Yeah.
But maybe now that we're starting to embrace this idea of augmented reality being a part of our lives, I guess I would love to see more people exploring the auditory dimensions of it.
Definitely. Um, we briefly talked about like the GPT-3 engine and sort of like AI type stuff. And like with like Dolly and like these visual engines and like stable diffusion, I feel like everybody's currently asking like, is the artist going to be replaced by AI? And I feel like for some reason AI hasn't really touched music that much yet. But I'm like, I don't have any worries about this type of stuff. But do you have any sort of commentary on this like technology that's coming in and how it might influence things for creatives?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the million-dollar question at the moment. Yeah, and I actually got a chance to play with Dolly recently, so it is interesting to see how these things are evolving. Again, I guess I would think of it as kind of a creative ecosystem, and these are sort of new entrants in the creative ecosystem. But like you, I don't have so many concerns. I mean, one thing the more we understand about the brain and cognition more generally is that it's really not a computer. We don't operate like a computer. Computers do things rather differently than we do, which is to say that I think we can what computers can offer may gain in significance as as we move forward, but there'll always be like the human touch that's desired to kind of make sense of it and think about how to use it. And I'm definitely not much of a kind of transhumanist, in the sense that I'm not so worried about the computers gaining sentience and eliminating us. That being said, I think we do need to think long and hard about how it is that we want to adopt these technologies, and what. But more so, it's often, the question is often how much do we want to give to our fellow humans that are going to take advantage of us rather than the computers. So, you mentioned all the kind of technology CEOs out there, but the business model right now is rather distorted in the sense that it's all about collecting private information and not much else. Yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, I guess we can end this here. Do you have any other topics that you wanted to hit, or commentary or anything you want to plug or promote?
Well, let's see. I mean, yeah, in some ways, I like to have sort of multiple projects going, and if anything, of late, I have enjoyed just composing music, new music, in the kind of modern jazz vein. I did a suite of music called Suite of Uncommon Sorrows that I wrote during the pandemic. I think the pandemic was a really fascinating moment. I mean, it was obviously a challenging moment and a sad moment for many, but I think for a lot of creatives, just having the opportunity to step back and think and maybe have a little more time to work on things was quite interesting. And so for me, I wrote an 11-part suite of new music that was, in my own small way, trying to understand the range of emotions that we were going through at the time. And I'm working on a sort of follow-up that I'm at least tentatively titling Cautiously Optimistic. So I try to remain an optimist at heart, and or at least a cautious optimist.
Very cool. And of course, just as a reminder, the book is Sink or Swarm, not Sink or Swim, Improvising Music in a Complex Age, which everybody should go and read. It's very interesting. But anyway, David Borgo, thanks for joining me. This has been a fun conversation.
Thank you so much, John. Yeah, it's been a pleasure for me as well.
All right, well, I will talk to you in the future, hopefully.
All right, take care.
Adios.